Hello, yes.
Hello, everyone. We are pleased to have you join this important conversation around human rights in China. I am Selina Morel. I am the program manager for China at the NGO Society for Threatened People. We organized this side event and we thank ISHR and the World Uyghur Congress very much for their input and support. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity today to listen to and learn from our speakers. Our panelists will today focus on women's rights in the People's Republic of China. In May of this year, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women reviewed the PRC, assessing the situation of women in Tibet, Hong Kong, the Uyghur region, and China. Gender-based discrimination and violence against women remain one of the most pressing issues affecting women from different communities inside Chinese borders. Through legislation and policies, the state has effectively been infringing and violating women's sexual and reproductive rights through measures like forced and coerced abortions or sterilizations. Other forms of gender-based discrimination include workplace harassment or domestic violence. Survivors are often stigmatized for having raised public awareness and reporting such incidents. The legislative framework of the PRC to protect women's basic rights and promote gender equality has to be addressed in this context. The failure to adopt legislation on sexual orientation discrimination, gender expression discrimination, and discrimination based on physical characteristics, as recommended by the Equal Opportunities Commission, is highly concerning. Disadvantaged groups of women, such as Uyghur and Tibetan women, also face economic and linguistic barriers in accessing justice. In this regard, access to education and economic opportunities is a vital aspect of women's rights. For ethnic groups, this translates to access to education in their mother tongue. Today's panel will shine a light on these critical issues that are affecting the rights and the lives of millions of women in Tibet, the Uyghur region, Hong Kong, and China.
Thank you, Selina. Welcome, everybody, to our side event today. My name is Pooja. I'm Program Director at the International Service for Human Rights. And I have the immense pleasure of moderating this discussion today. I'm joined with a very powerful panel who I will introduce quickly. In the room with me today is Zumratai Arkin, who is from the World Uyghur Congress, and Pema Doma from the Students for a Free Tibet. And online, we will also be joined by Fei Chen from the Network Chinese Human Rights Defenders, and Linda Wong, a distinguished lawyer from Hong Kong. Before starting our event, I want to underscore that we will not tolerate any instances of reprisals, any intimidation or harassment, either verbally or through the form of photos, towards any of the panelists or anybody else inside of this room. There are only two people authorized to take photos and record today. I'd like you to raise your hands. It's my colleagues Christine and also Ibtihar. Hello, Ibtihar. For some background on the Cedaw review, China has been a states party to the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women since 1980. Since then, the Cedaw Committee has periodically reviewed China and Hong Kong government's compliance with their obligations to eliminate discrimination against women. In the latest review, which was its 6th review in May, it covered a period from 2014 up until now. 55 groups from civil society engaged with the process, many of them taking great risks and specific measures to ensure their security for doing so. We consider that nearly 25, so almost half of them, were government-organized NGOs, known as Gongos, who made submissions to the Cedaw Committee. The increase of Gongos in this and in other human rights spaces at the UN is of particular concern to all of us. Not only does it risk biasing the impartiality of the information provided to the committee, where they echo in detail the government's positions, it also increases the risk of reprisals against independent civil society members and women human rights defenders. So in this regard, I would like to underscore also that instances of reprisals against civil society engaging during reviews of China by human rights committees are regularly reported. This includes the review this February by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as reported in the most recent report of the UN Secretary General's on reprisals, which was released last week. This includes numerous civil society reports of the UN's online webcast and OHCHR being unavailable or unreachable from inside China while the review is taking place in Geneva. The Cedaw Committee released its findings and recommendations in May, in which they make recommendations to ensure the protection of women's rights on a range of fields, including the rights of women in Hong Kong, Tibet, and Uyghur women and girls, LGBTI women, women defenders in civil society, women with disabilities, rural women, North Korean women, recommendations on sexual and reproductive rights, as well as labor rights, and you will hear more about this from our panelists. I want to also acknowledge the work that they are doing in monitoring, documenting, and reporting on the violations faced by their communities, and their relentless work in making the submissions and following processes and appearing here before all of you in order to make the case for accountability. You will do this in increasingly challenging contexts, and we stand in solidarity with you all. I also want to remind you that this conversation does not happen in a void. While we are having this discussion, brave women human rights defenders in China are facing the ire of an authoritarian and patriarchal state. I would like to bring your attention to in particular to feminist journalist Huang Xueqin, whose early investigation of sexual harassment cases in the media industry and publication of an article in the case of Luo Shishi was one of the triggers for China's Me Too movement. Huang was tried in secret last Friday. No independent monitor was allowed in, and the outcome is unknown. But we now know that she has been charged with the national security crime of inciting subversion of state power for speaking out against sexual harassment. This is the cost. And so with that, I am opening the panel, and I turn first to you, Zumrete.
Thank you, Pooja. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm speaking on behalf of the Society for Threatened Peoples and also the World Uyghur Congress. Thank you for the organizers for providing a safe space where our voices can be heard. I am pleased to be joining this panel with brilliant advocates. My name is Zumrete Erkin. I am a Uyghur human rights defender. To support Pooja's point on reprisals, I would like to make the point that I face reprisals during the Cedaw's process this May. The Cedaw review on China allowed important questions to be raised regarding the rights of Uyghur and Turkic women in the region. Uyghur women are deprived of normal family life, being separated from their children who may have been sent to state-run boarding schools and their partners who may have been sent to internment camps. But women are also being limited in their participation in cultural, social, and religious life with the hanging threat of punishment. The Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women raised the situation of hundreds of Uyghur women who are subject to re-education through so-called vocational training centers. Their detention is arbitrary and held without trial or due process, all under the counterterrorism framework. Women from all walks of life have been taken to these camps, including scholars, cultural figures, and ordinary people. The cases of Dr. Gülşen Abbas, who received a lengthy sentence, or of Dr. Rahila Dawood, a prominent Uyghur folklore scholar, received a life sentence, as confirmed last week. The government of China is engaging in a systematic campaign to eradicate Uyghur culture, religion, and language. Many of the former detainees we spoke to have experienced some form of physical and mental abuse, including sexual violence, rape, torture, and forced sterilization inside these camps. In the context of family life, Uyghur women have also lost the right to make autonomous decisions. Indeed, there have been increased efforts by authorities to coerce marriages between Han men and Uyghur Turkic women, which was raised during Cedaw. The Uyghur Han marriage strategy offers 10,000 yuan per year for up to 5 years for interethnic couples to marry, provided the marriage remains harmonious. In addition, similar to Tibet, the separation of Uyghur children from their parents to be then sent to state boarding schools where they are subjected to another form of re-education is a harrowing reality. Just this week, 3 UN experts have expressed their grave concern over this campaign and the erosion of the linguistic and cultural rights of the children. Still, the most alarming issue remains the coerced birth control policies on Uyghur and Turkic women, as highlighted by the Cedaw Committee. Since 2015, the government of China has made efforts to reduce the birth rate of Uyghur women through coercive family planning, including through forced sterilization. Birth rates among Uyghurs plummeted from 2015 to 2018, with population growth in the Uyghur region falling by over 84% in the 2 largest Uyghur prefectures, Kashgar and Hotan. In 2018, 80% of all net added IUD placements in China were performed in the Uyghur region, despite the fact that the region only makes up 1.8% of the nation's population. Between 2015 and 2018, the regional government placed 7.8 times more net added IUDs per capita than the national average. The decline in birth rate in the region was the evidence which the Uyghur Tribunal relied on in their 2021 findings of genocide. When confronted with the question on the drop of birth rates during the Cedaw review, a Chinese delegation member responded by pointing to high birth rates among all ethnic minorities, obscuring the fact that Uyghur birth rates in particular declined significantly over the years. Government documents indicate that local authorities are given instructions to punish Uyghur women who violate birth control targets with internment in the camps. The Karakash list, a leaked document, shows that the most frequently cited reason for internment of Uyghur and Turkic women was a violation of birth control policies. Additionally, Uyghur women are also subjected to forced labor under the state-imposed forced labor program as part of the poverty alleviation, vocational training, re-education through labor, and the extremification campaign. Uyghur women are often a target of programs involving satellite factories within the Uyghur region, which often amount to small workshops built in villages to put women and others with household and childcare responsibilities to work. Government documents indicate that these programs are designed with thought transformation in mind to convince women to participate, and some documents argue that the satellite factories liberate women and combat extremism at the same time, leading Uyghur women into an acceptance of modern culture. The Cedaw findings reiterated issues that were previously raised by special rapporteurs and other UN bodies since 2018. Despite numerous critical questions during the Cedaw review, the Chinese government delegation consistently refused to acknowledge any of the issues raised and provided long-winded responses with little relevance to the request from the committee. The Chinese government, despite stating that it seeks cooperation with UN systems and mechanisms and special procedure mandate holders, has allowed access to a very few experts on a very selective basis since 2018. There are currently 15 pending visit requests from mandate holders without any success. I will end by stating that it is crucial that member states continue to hold perpetrators to account. It is also essential that treaty bodies and UN mandate holders continue to document on these abuses to build a strong jurisprudence. Thank you.
Thank you, Zumrate. I will turn now to Faye, who is joining us online.
Hello, everyone. Pooja, can you hear me? Can the room hear me? Hello? Pooja, can you give some indication of whether I should go forward?
Go ahead, Faye.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, thanks Aisha and STP for providing this opportunity to share and learn from this panel. I'm really honored to be joining it and also to stand in solidarity with our Tibetan, Uyghur, and Hong Kong friends here. So to provide a brief overview of the committee's findings, The committee noted that there was a lot of progress made by the state that was all in the form of laws and plans. So, for example, the Civil Code Amendment establishing civil liability for sexual harassment in 2020, anti-domestic violence in 2015, and then there was also the criminalization of trafficking of women and children also in 2015. So that was the progress. But we also know that the committee consistently raised concerns about a lack of data about the implementation of these laws. How do we know how much these reforms are actually improving the lives of women? Well, to the extent that such data was available, the picture is actually pretty bad. So, for example, since the anti-domestic violence law took effect in 2016, the government says that there were 15,000 protective orders that were issued by December 2022. So that's a little more than 2,000 protective orders a year, which is a number by itself that raises questions in a country as big as China. So we also know that courts routinely ignore domestic violence claims. An academic survey of 150,000 divorce trials from 2009 to 2016 found that in 82% of divorce cases, judges completely ignored domestic violence that was mentioned by plaintiffs. So, in one case last year in Gansu, a woman filed for divorce after her husband slashed her shoulder open with a knife. And the judge said that this didn't constitute domestic violence because she had to prove that she had been regularly assaulted over a long period in order for it to constitute domestic violence, and he dismissed her case. So it's really common for judges to also support abusers' claims that the abuse is just a normal part of marriage. I'm happy to talk more about the reasons for the judge's extraordinary distortions in the Q&A. But what I would say for now is that the government's own statistics and the independent civil society research shows is that the new laws are not doing very much to protect women because there's little to no support for actually enforcing them. There's no training of judges, prosecutors, or law enforcement officials, and then there's few, if any, guidelines for implementation at lower levels. And then also, there's just very little accountability at any level for failing to enforce the laws. So, for example, the civil code, it requires employers to take measures, quote unquote, to prevent and stop sexual harassment. But then there's no liability for violations by employers. So, the system is actually so unfriendly to victims that a survey of civil cases involving sexual harassment since 2019 found it's actually more common for an alleged perpetrator to file suit than an alleged victim. So, a ratio of 43% to 33%. So I would say that the committee's findings were really sensitive to this, and they consistently raised the issue of judicial bias and the need for training and capacity building for judges, prosecutors, lawyers, law enforcement, and other government officials. And I want to emphasize here that the quality of information that the independent experts of the committee have is really dependent on the continued access of civil society to the review. But that's really getting harder for the reasons that Pooja and Sumritai mentioned earlier when it comes to reprisals. So the threat of retaliation against those participating is made perhaps most clear by the death and detention of grassroots human rights defender Cao Shunli 10 years ago after she planned to travel to Geneva and to engage with UN human rights mechanisms. So other groups participating in treaty body reviews, they've had their offices ransacked after they submitted reports. So this really discourages continued submission of information. We also know that people inside China attempting to follow the Cedaw review face numerous obstacles, like Pooja mentioned. We would also add that the folks who post the link to the UN web stream inviting others to watch had their accounts frozen for several days. So this behavior, it really threatens to turn the review into, at best, a pretty meaningless exercise. At worst, it will turn it into a whitewashing performance that's done solely for the benefit of the international community. So, reflecting on what the Chinese government has done to restrict access to reviews for civil society, I want to share some words that would be familiar to Chinese speakers. 一个健康的社会不该只有一种声音. A healthy society should have more than one voice. The committee recognized the importance of these different voices when it highlighted the controls and crackdown on women human rights defenders and civil society in its findings. In fact, it's these women who are behind some of the policy changes that the Chinese government highlights in its own report. So, for example, as Puja mentioned, the journalist Huang Xueqing, who was a major force behind China's Me Too movement, it was that movement that actually generated the popular support that became the impotence for the change in the civil code. Xueqing has been in detention for 2 years, and then, as Puja mentioned, she was tried last week for inciting subversion. The government's evidence against her and her friend Wang Jianbing is that they gathered with friends at Wang's apartment to discuss, and this is from the indictment, quote, social topics. The crackdown on civil society over the last few years has been so thorough that the government is now targeting informal social gatherings of people who have shown leadership on important social issues in the past, like Xueqing. The government shouldn't be so afraid that the rest of the world would hear what these other voices have to say. But nonetheless, they disappear them, they threaten their families, they sentence them to prison, when what these women are just trying to do is give a little bit of dignity back to people who have been beaten down by this system. So we'll see a backsliding in women's rights in China because of this crackdown on civil society. But rights defenders are going to continue supporting women and other groups that society has left behind. And they're going to continue to share what information they can with UN human rights mechanisms. It's because they believe that a healthy society should have more than one voice. It's their hope that as the crackdown on their work becomes more intense inside, people like you listening here today would help to keep these issues alive outside by continuing to pose hard questions to Chinese representatives about what women are really experiencing inside of China's borders. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Faye. I turn now to Pema from Students for a Free Tibet.
Thank you, Pooja. And I also want to thank the International Services for Human Rights and the Society for Threatened Peoples for co-sponsoring this event. It truly is a privilege to be speaking alongside cross-movement allies like Zumratai and Faye, as well as Linda. My name is Pema Dama, and I am a Tibetan human rights and climate activist and the daughter of Tibetan refugees. I currently serve as the Executive Director of Students for Free Tibet, and I'm here today on behalf of the Tibet Advocacy Coalition, a joint coalition of 6 Tibetan groups working in unison to raise the issue of Tibet at the United Nations. Earlier this year, the coalition submitted evidence to the Cedaw Committee. Before jumping into the key concerns and recommendations made by the committee, I'd like to just take a small moment to re-emphasize what Pooja, Zumratai, and Faye have already mentioned about the recent report on the reprisals by Secretary General's office. I think it's really important for us to take a moment just to think about the fact that in our work, in our days here at the UN, any Tibetan women, any Uyghur women, any Hong Kongers and Chinese that we speak with, whether they're living in the home country or in diaspora, are all facing risks of reprisals, are all making themselves vulnerable to these elevated risks in order to bring this information and dialogue here, which is such a crucial role. So I just wanted to take a moment to raise that. The committee has raised many issues facing Tibetan women and girls, including Tibetan women's access to justice, trafficking, the confiscation of passports, residential boarding schools, linguistic rights, employment and labor transfer concerns. And I will just touch on several of those today. There was almost a 400% increase just in the reference to the word Tibetans compared to the concluding observations of the 2014 review. This should tell you a lot about the rising concerns by UN bodies and the general increase in the UN documentation on rights violations in Tibet in recent years. As many of you know, the issue of residential boarding schools in Tibet has been and continues to be a serious concern to many around the world, including UN experts, since 2022. At the end of 2022, we saw this topic form the longest communication to date by special rapporteurs on Tibet, and in February of 2023, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights used extremely strong language and called on China to, quote, immediately abolish these coercive residential schools. In May, we saw Cedaw also use strong language in calling on China to abolish these coerced residential schools, drawing specific attention to their impact on Tibetan girls. At the same time, they called on China to, quote, authorize the establishment and subsidize private Tibetan schools, which can create access to education on a local level. Today, right now, there are more than 1 million Tibetan children between the ages of 4 and 18, which makes up approximately 80% of that entire population, who are currently separated from their families in government-run boarding schools. This includes an estimated 100 to 150,000 4- and 5-year-olds, children who are living in boarding preschools for at least 5 days per week, separated from their mothers and families. In these, children are required to study in Mandarin. They are not allowed to practice their religion, and they are subjected to highly politicized curriculum, which is fed to them purely for the intent of ensuring that by the time they leave the school, they identify as Chinese, not as Tibetan. Cedaw also called on China to ensure that, quote, girls and women have access to instruction in their mother tongue, such as Tibetan language, and to reverse the closure of schools providing instruction in minority languages. The Tibetan language, as well as the Uyghur language and Mongolian language, are under attack by Beijing. The committee also made a series of other strong Tibet-specific recommendations, including in relation to the labor transfer and vocational training programs, which they noted, quote, Tibetan women training in low-skilled jobs and discard their unique skills, and undermine the religious, linguistic, and cultural identity of Tibetan women. The beautiful traits, the sustainable way of life, the invaluable indigenous wisdom that millions of Tibetan nomadic women have cultivated over generations and generations. All of these are being forcibly assimilated by China within a matter of a single generation. That too at a time when the world more desperately than ever needs the wisdom and the skills, the sustainable wisdom of indigenous peoples such as Tibetan women and nomads. Concerns regarding the labor transfer program have already been raised by other UN experts as well, including in a joint communication to the Chinese government earlier this year, as well as in 2022 report of the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking and Contemporary Forms of Slavery. The committee simultaneously raised concern over the confiscation of passports from Tibetan women and called on China to ensure that national security legislation is not arbitrarily used as the basis to do so. Restrictions on freedom of movement are a massive issue that Tibetans are collectively facing right now. And Tibetan women and girls, just in any form of repression, the intersectionality of the issue means that Tibetan women and girls are suffering even more greatly under this system. How can the rights of Tibetan women and girls be protected when there are currently 25 outstanding requests by special procedures to visit China? When these requests have been outstanding for as long as 15 years. 15 years ago, I was an elementary school student. Now I'm a woman speaking here at the UN to you guys. And yet China has still not granted any of these UN experts access to the region. Tibetan girls inside Tibet today, they cannot wait. The 4-year-olds inside Tibet today, they cannot wait 15 years for a UN expert to gain access. And that kind of just leaves us asking the same question all the time. Why? Why has a visit by the Working Group on Discrimination against Women and Girls not taken place to China for over a decade? What's happening right now today in terms of oversight of the human rights conditions inside Tibet, inside the Uyghur area, Hong Kong, and throughout China, it's not good enough. It's not good enough for the countless Tibetan girls who lie awake at night separated from their families, wondering when they will be allowed to return home in residential schools. It is not good enough for Tibetan girls and women who have had their passports confiscated because the very act of them being a Tibetan deems them to be a national security threat in the eyes of China. It is not good enough for the Tibetan nomads who are subjected to forced removal from their grasslands that they have tended for a millennia and are now at risk of forced labor in what China terms as vocational training programs. It is not good enough for Tibetan school teachers such as Rinchen Ki, whose whereabouts were completely unknown for over 9 months when she was forcibly disappeared until a UN communication raised her case in February of 2022, which forced China to disclose her location. This is all just not good enough. China is not above the law, and Tibetan women are certainly not below it. It is crucial that member states echo these strong recommendations which have been made by Cedaw and call on China to uphold its international human rights obligations. Without doing so, we would risk sending an extremely worrying message to Tibetan women, to Uyghur women, Hong Konger women, those who are living on the ground, who are struggling for their most basic human rights today. It is a message that their human rights need not be respected on an international platform, not be protected nor fulfilled. And that is a message that we cannot afford to send and that we must not send. Thank you.
Thank you, Pema. And then our final panelist today is Linda, who is also joining us online.
Thank you, Pooja. I'm going to talk about Hong Kong's issues under this Cedaw scheme. Actually, Hong Kong women's group and also the civil society used to be a very active participant in the Cedaw sections. Some of us have attended since 2004 and much earlier. But in this year's sections, though we have quite a number of groups, NGOs submitting their shadows report, but I understand that not many of the women's group or the human rights group or civil societies NGOs have actually attended the hearing to provide some more on-ground information. And obviously, we know why, because that's what's happening in the previous years in Hong Kong. And so here comes to the structural obstacles that I would like to share on this protection and fulfillment of women's rights in Hong Kong. I would put it simply in two aspects. One is about the inaction of the Hong Kong government and the legislature to introduce certain legislative reforms, which are very significant to provide equality to women and also protection of women from different kinds of violence and discriminations. And actually, this has been highlighted in the concluding observation under the legislative framework. The committee also notes that there's been significant delay by the Hong Kong government and also the legislature to pass several reforms in order to enhance protection of women. And these kind of legal reforms or the areas of concern actually has been noticed or has been expressed concerned by the committee in the previous several sections already. One of it is concerning about the reform about sexual offences law. In Hong Kong, we have this Law Reform Commission, which has spent more than 15 years to review all the relevant laws concerning sexual offences. And despite the committee has raised concern in its previous section in 2014, in its concluding observation, that why there's no such law passed in order to reflect all these recommendations of the Law Reform Commission, the Hong Kong government in in this past 9 or 10 years, still haven't reviewed these relevant legislations as recommended by the Law Reform Commission. And in 2019, the LRC, the Law Reform Commission, finally published its last report in which it put forward a series of final recommendations of sexual offense reforms. And compared to other countries who have revised and updated their relevant laws over the past 20 years, Hong Kong has been decades behind to update its law to provide more significant protection to victims of sexual violence and also to those mentally incapacitated persons and children as well. And so in this in this year's concluding observation, the committee once again urged the Hong Kong government to take action immediately. So this is one example of the inaction of the government and also our legislature in Hong Kong. Another example is on the amendment of the sexual discrimination ordinance. Actually, it is also recommended by the Equal Opportunity Commissions. They have urged the government to amend the law so that there can be more enhanced protection of victims of sexual harassment in the workplace. But nonetheless, we still see nowhere the law will be passed the soonest. Thirdly, there's also the legislation on sexual orientation discrimination, gender expression discrimination, discrimination based on physical characteristics. And these are also the recommendation urged by the Equal Opportunity Commission in Hong Kong. And actually, in 2018, there's this survey conducted by a reputable Hong Kong academics institution that 69% of the public in Hong Kong favored an anti-discrimination legislations that protects people from being discriminated because of sexual orientation. But still, we have all these voices, no matter from the institution like Law Reform Commission or the Equal Opportunity Commission, or from academics, or even from the general public. But we see nothing has been put forward by the government or have any laws passed in the legislation. And lastly, we have a very recent Court of Final Appeal judgment, and is concerning about this same-sex marriage. And in this recent Court of Final Appeal judgment, it was declared that the Hong Kong government failed to fulfill its positive obligation to establish an alternative framework for legal recognition of same-sex relationships. So once again, new law and policy is required to ensure sexual minorities, including LGBTI women, enjoy the same protections and human rights as heterosexual couples. However, even this declaration has to be suspended for a period of 2 years. And so it is still unknown how long afterwards will the government put forward any legal framework. And from the previous experience, it could take like another 10 years or so. Besides, it's also still unknown what will be the contents of such legal framework, if any. And so that this inaction of the Hong Kong government and also the legislature to introduce legislative reforms deprived women and also the general public in Hong Kong all these protections and also all this non-discrimination that they and women and girls they are entitled to under the Cedaw. So this is on one hand the structural obstacles that we are now facing in Hong Kong. And on the other side of the same coin is we have this shrinking space for the civil society in Hong Kong. So actually, this is also has been spotted in the concluding observation by the committee in this year. In the concluding observation, the committee actually urged the Hong Kong government to refrain from over-prioritizing public order and security concerns when considering restrictions on democratic manifestation after it has noticed that certain incidents happen, which is the annual Labour and Women's Right and Gender Equality March were forced to be cancelled this year. And these rallies, including the International Women's Day March, have been annually held in the past decades and have been peaceful all along. But now, under the new national security law regime, even these annual peaceful marches and demonstrations may not be tolerated or allowed by the government. And so the committees also urged the Hong Kong government that they should take into account this paramount importance of the right of peaceful assembly. So with this shrinking civic space, with the inaction of the government and also the legislature to enhance, to pass new laws or to reform the law to enhance protection for women. This is the structural obstacles in order to implement all these recommendations of the Cedaw. So I would stop it here now first, so I may answer any questions from the floor at the Q&A sections. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you to all of our panelists for your very important updates of the context and the situation, and also linking it with your experiences of Cedaw. We have roughly just under 20 minutes, and I wanted to see if we could open to the floor now if there were any interventions. We would like to take first a maximum of 3. And you have 2 minutes for a question, and I would really appreciate your name and affiliation as you're making your question. I see the European Union and the United States.
Thank you very much. I'm Theseus Poulos with the European Union. You referenced a number of UN processes, treaty body reviews, special procedures, joint statements, communications, and the like. In view, as well as the upcoming UPR review, I would like to ask you, from your perspective, what impact these various processes have had on the ground. Thank you.
Many thanks to the Society of Threatened People for bringing us together today, and for the panelists for sharing their experiences. I'm a representative of the United States here in Geneva. I want to revisit what several of the panelists mentioned about reprisals. The United States is deeply concerned about the chilling effect of reprisals against human rights defenders and other civil society actors, both online and offline. We remember Kaohsiung Lee, who was arrested 10 years ago this month on her way to Geneva to participate in a session of the Human Rights Council, and later died in prison. The fact that several of the panelists feel they cannot safely show their face while participating demonstrates that the danger human rights defenders face when daring to challenge the government's version of events has only increased. I'm struck by the point that one of the panelists made, that if reprisals against those seeking to cooperate with UN mechanisms are not addressed, treaty bodies and other expert mechanisms may no longer have access to any objective data about the human rights situation in China. So my question for the panelists is, what more can member states and UN offices here in Geneva do to ensure that civil society can safely participate in such UN proceedings? Thank you.
Thank you for those 2 very important questions. There was one last one. Phil?
Well, thank you, Pooja. Phil Lynch from the International Service for Human Rights, and thank you very much to the panelists. I guess 2 reflections, or 2 comments that I'd love the panel's reflections on. I come from a country, Australia, which up until the 1970s itself practiced a policy of the removal and separation of Aboriginal children from their families. And what I can tell you from that experience is that it is obviously a violation of the rights of individuals, of the best interests of the child. It tears apart families, it devastates communities, it propagates profound intergenerational trauma. But of most relevance, I guess... of most relevance to the Chinese Communist Party is that it really weakens the national fabric, and it divides and undermines the stability of the nation on an ongoing basis. And reflecting on the Australian experience, what's absolutely imperative is that there be an immediate cessation of the policy in the Uyghur region and Tibet, that there be recognition and protection of cultural and minority rights, that there be an apology, that there be compensation, that there be guarantees of non-repetition. Otherwise, it will continue to cause profound trauma to the nation for the next 50 years. I also just wanted to reflect on the forthcoming Human Rights Council elections, because from what you've very clearly said, China is responsible for atrocity crimes. It's responsible for the widespread repression of civil society, and it's engaged in a policy of systematic non-cooperation with the UN and reprisals against those who seek to give evidence or testimony to the UN. So I wondered if you wanted to reflect on China's fitness to be elected to the Human Rights Council.
Thank you. I will let the panelists respond. Maybe we'll go to our colleagues online first. Faye, would you like to respond to any of those questions?
Sure, I'll respond to the first question. I think it's maybe helpful to start off by giving a little bit of context about China and Cedaw and women's rights. For countries that are concerned about the efficacy of their engagement with China, I think you can really consider making gender equality issues a focus for your questions and recommendations, because I think performance on women's rights is really a pillar of legitimacy for the party. This is because oppression of women was one of the primary characteristics associated with feudalism that the party was overturning in the middle of the 20th century. So, for example, one of the first laws that was passed by the revolutionary government was the marriage law in 1950, and that prohibited concubinage and arranged marriage and provided for divorce. So, and then also, China was among the first group of state parties to Cedaw in 1980. And then 3 years later, it had already submitted its first report. I don't know if maybe the 10-year gap between reports for the most recent review was maybe an indication of less enthusiasm, but I would overall say that performance on Cedaw reviews and women's issues still matter a lot because of the party's unique history. So, I mean, I feel like that's maybe the spirit animating the question about what impact all of the various processes have had on the ground. But to respond a bit more directly, despite the attempts to block access to the Cedaw processes and to these other mechanisms, really, I think it's hard to overstate actually how much impact, particularly in the context of women's rights, the popularization of women's rights as a human rights issue has really transformed the Chinese civil society, starting from the Beijing Women's Conference in '95. And it really, the Chinese civil society's interaction with the international human rights system, I think women's rights has really been a very important conduit for that. And as for, while the space has shrunk a lot in the meantime, it's still a really important avenue for civil society members to be heard. So, and also a lot of what the independent rights experts are able to say does manage to make it back in ways that can be, for example, cited by civil society members when they're making recommendations to their own government at the National People's Congress, etc. And I can also give more examples, but I'll leave it here to leave room for other interventions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and my apologies from where I was sitting. I didn't actually see that the representative from China had their flag raised as well, so I'd like to give you the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I will not repeat what has been already said by the Chinese government at various official occasions, but maybe just some basic figures and facts. For the past 40 years, the population of Uyghur increased from 5.55 million to 12 million. From 2010 to 2018, the Uyghur population grew by 25%. In the same period of time, the Han people grew by only 2%. So that is 25% versus 2%. In the past decade, ethnic minorities in China, in terms of their population, they grew by 10.26%. In the same period of time, the Han people grew by 4.93%. China has already welcomed over 2,000 journalists, diplomats, experts, and people from all walks of life, over 100 countries and regions to visit Xinjiang. Our doors remain open, and regrettably, not all those invitations have been accepted. And I won't repeat the official lines whatsoever, but I want to draw your attention to the basic fact that if you open any renminbi cash note, you will see not only the national common language, but also you see that in the Uyghur, Tibetan, and Mongolian language. If you go to Qinghai Autonomous Region or any neighboring provinces to the Tibet Autonomous Region, you see religious worshippers kowtowing and kneeling their way on their journeys of pilgrimage all the way to Lhasa, where sometimes the population were kind of large on the road, that cars had to make way for them. Also, if you visit Kashgar or any local places in Xinjiang, you will see that for any shop on their billboards, the names were in both Chinese and Uyghur language. And also, if you go to any subway station in Hong Kong, and when you arrive at the station, you hear that in Chinese, English, and Cantonese. I can give you many more examples, but in the interest of time, I would only to stress here that lies remain lies if they are repeated 1,000 times. And any effort to contain China's developments in the name of whatever are doomed to fail. I thank you.
I will bring you back to the panelists now to respond to any of the questions and comments that have come from the floor.
Thank you for the questions. Just to maybe answer the EU mission's question regarding the, I guess, the advantages or what engaging with these UN processes has actually done for the situation on the ground. I think it's I don't think that we've seen so much change on the ground, to put it simply. I mean, in the Uyghur region, people are still arbitrarily extrajudicially detained. The repression is still there, and especially after Xi Jinping's recent visit to Urumqi, where he reiterated that the counterterrorism policies are part of a longer plan, it signals that the repression is nowhere to end. But I think what we've seen, what we've observed while engaging with these UN processes over the past few years is that when UN experts have raised the issue, have reported on the issue, especially with the independent assessment of the High Commissioner's Office last year, I think it has changed in China's response on how China responds to specific cases or questions. And I think for the Uyghur diaspora community who has actually lost communication with relatives from 2017 until now, it is important that we learn about the whereabouts of our relatives who have been missing or detained since 2017. So I think it helped in that sense where on very high profile cases, for example, Ilham Tohti or Rahila Dawood, Gulshan Abbas, the family members have actually learned the whereabouts or the conditions of detention of about their relatives through requests from working groups or special rapporteurs, UN experts. So I think this is incredibly important to push to also for member states to keep addressing raising these cases as well. Not only just the cases, but also the situation in general. And perhaps maybe on also the reprisals question, it is incredibly important that member states and UN bodies, they do everything they can to ensure that safe space for civil society organizations, but that they also report it, that they raise it during interactive dialogues, during items, general debates, and different using different opportunities. I think this is one thing that we want to see, and also that they hold the perpetrators to account, because for us as defenders, as victims, the UN has to be a safe space. And if the UN is no longer a safe space, then it is the end for us.
Thank you. Yes, and I will just respond to the questions by the EU and the US first. I think that these processes, these treaty body reviews, are absolutely crucial. The violations that are documented show that there is a need for accountability. And in terms of on the ground, the impact that it has, I think that we have seen that China is sensitive to when we raise awareness about the violations that have been taking place. This is something that's become very evident, such as for them blocking the broadcasts of these types of reviews. So it really shows that this is something that is not necessarily, it shows that it must be discussed. In terms of human rights improvements, there has to be even more pressure. I think this includes member states working in unison, because when one member state stands up alone, it oftentimes can be used by China or by others as being a reason for why it is a point of bias or whatnot. And I think that in terms of the situation of women and girls inside Tibet, inside the Uyghur region, they need that unity. They need those joint voices coming up together. And also, I think in terms of the US's question, in terms of reprisals, I think that the documentation and support of those that have faced consequences is important, but also creating space where there is accessibility for civil society groups to meet, either individually one-on-one or in a joint member briefing outside of the space where there can be a lower risk of reprisals for those that speak up. So these types of, I think, mechanisms or ways in which, means in which civil society organizations can speak out, I think are crucial. And when you think about even the case, for example, of a woman human rights defender, Rinchen Ki, in her community inside Tibet, there was one Tibetan school where she was a teacher. And she's like in any other country or area around the world where you would see a teacher who's passionate about the learning and development of their children. When that school was shut down by the Chinese government, she was unable to withhold her discontent with that policy decision. And that resulted in her being detained and actually forcibly disappeared by the Chinese government. So in terms of speaking out, the actions that Tibetans inside Tibet are taking, these need to be given kind of the support and backing for human rights defenders at the UN.
Thank you very much. And just in closing, I just wanted to repeat something that was in Faye's intervention earlier on. I believe it's a quote that is attributed to Dr. Li Wenliang, who was one of the first COVID whistleblowers. A healthy society should have more than one voice. And with that, we close this panel. Thank you so much to all of our panelists here and also online, and for all of you joining us today as well.